Recording in progress.
Welcome, everyone. I am Hector Hoyos. I'm a professor of Iberian and Latin American cultures, and by courtesy of comparative literature, also director of modern thought and literature. And it truly is my pleasure to welcome you all to this event. We are having our roundtable entitled Anti-Colonial, Interdisciplinarity, Roundtable on Law and Humanities in the Global South. I'd like to start by sharing a little bit about the context of this conversation, what kind of scholarly engagement it speaks to. The first thing to note is that it is the second event in a series. The series is called Law and Humanities from the Global South. Now, what that means is having considered the state of the discipline in law and humanities, working with, for instance, the collections by Bernie Myler here at Stanford and Liz Anker at Cornell. There is one big gap in this orientation, which is not just the study of the Global South, but also the study from the Global South. To think of the Global South as a site of enunciation for understanding the intricate connections between law and the humanities, rather than just being an object that one theorizes upon through such topics as truth and reconciliation commissions and so on, or human rights for of course. So we want to engage, of course, with the state of the discipline, of which we are very appreciative, but also try to push it in a different direction. And to that end, our first event, which took place a little earlier this year, I want to say in March 27th, and I'm going to be sharing a link in the chat for folks who are interested, discussed the connections between the idea of the rights of nature and the imagination, right? That was kind of like our running theme. And I think, we truly produced some new knowledge there in the distinguished company of Diana Esther Guzman, who's an associate professor at law at Universidad Nacional, Lila Neri from Occidental College, Beth Piatot here from UC Berkeley, Marco Wan, who was connecting from Hong Kong that day, among other scholars. I won't rehash like the full lineup on or the proceedings of that first event, but I just wanted to bring that into our conversation because we're trying to build this kind of continuity. What would it entail to think about law and humanities from the Global South? How can we add to that body of emerging knowledge? Serendipitously, and actually, no, I should say that by design, we work with our partners at the Humanities Center, with Roland Green in particular, who's probably watching. And we had just yesterday an amazing talk that is, relevant to thinking about anti-coloniality by Adam Gerachew. Adam, who is also involved in this initiative, has been thinking about the global framework and the age of empires, but truly from the South, changing the narratives of the Peace of Westphalia. Her newest work is also developing another angle to this problematic. So she's one of our interlocutors. And then the other component of our gathering today has to do with a journal which is housed at the Stanford Humanities Center. And it's a journal that has a really unique charter in that it's neither as formal as something like Critical Inquiry, nor as informal as something like the Los Angeles Review of Books. It sits happily in the middle, and it has special issues connected to topics of interest across the humanities. So there is the possibility that our conversation today might result in a special issue of occasion, but then also don't feel obliged. We can discuss that going forward. I just want to put all of the pieces of the puzzle here together. If we do want to proceed in that direction, there is a chance that we could have a continuity of this conversation in person in beautiful Palo Alto at some point in the fall quarter. our finding with Joe Wager, my co-organizer here today, is that we have much scatteredness in our efforts and in this Zoom era. So please think of this as the first of hopefully a series of conversations that will organically result in new knowledge and new knowledge production and new ideas. That is our charter. With that, I am going to pass the mic, as it were, over to Joe, who is going to tell us about our format today and, of course, about our distinguished speakers. Joe.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hector. So just a little bit about the format before I introduce our speakers. So we'll begin with individual questions. So each person will respond to an individual question. And after they have a chance to respond, we'll move on to a general question that each speaker will respond to. And we find this gives a nice dynamic to open up conversation between the different areas that we're all working on, and also to create space for people in the audience to formulate their own questions and have their own interventions. So of course, feel free throughout the entire presentation to leave questions in the chat. And if not, at the end, we can open up and people can turn on their mics, and I'll promote people to panelists, and we can have that conversation face to face, as it were. All right. So to begin, Susana Draper teaches comparative literature at Princeton. Draper is the author of Ciudad Postletrada y Tiempos Lúmpenes, Crítica Cultural y Nihilismo en la Cultura de Fin de Siglo. Also, Afterlives of Confinement, Spatial Transitions in Post-Dictatorship Latin America. And most recently, 1968 Mexico, Constellations of Freedom and Democracy. Wonderful text, and you'll never see them all the same way. Samera Esmeir teaches in the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of Juridical Humanity, A Colonial History, and is currently writing The Struggle That Remains Between World and International. She is the senior editor of Critical Times, Interventions in Global Political Theory, where Susana is also part of the editorial board. And they have an excellent recent edition that is with a cutting analysis of the anti-colonial impulse that is also on our mind, generating and a catalyst for the conversations that we're having today and beyond. And Joseph Slaughter teaches post-colonial literature and theory, human rights, and literary approaches to international law in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He was the recipient of a number of prestigious prizes, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, and his work includes The Field Shaping Human Rights, Inc., The World Novel, Narrative Form, and International Law, as well as the co-edited The Global South Atlantic. So to begin with our questions, my first question will be for Samera, and it is, what are the limitations and affordances of the notion of international as that which reconfigures horizons of struggle? And how is this related to the way in which the international is represented in university departments and centers?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for including me in this conversation. Thank you, Hector. Thank you, Joy. And thank you, of course, Joy and Susana, for being here. You're all friends, and it's good to be in this company. I want to begin by noting that when I think about the question, when I started thinking about the question of international, the word and what it does, I started thinking from the grounds of Palestine. Although what I have to say next has very little to do with Palestine, I'm actually thinking from that place. So it is not about Palestine as much as it is a place from which I think larger questions that have to do with the world. For me, Palestine illuminates a particular condition that allows me to think particular processes and questions. So I've been interested in thinking about the limits and the possibilities of what we call internationalization, which then led me to the question of what international is, in order to then pursue the question of internationalization and what it means to internationalize in the juridical sense. What does that mean? What does internationalization do? The word international, as is well known, has a history, and over the past 2 centuries, it has accumulated several layers of meanings, and not all of them are compatible. Contemporary uses mobilize these diverse meanings and along the way generate distinct theoretical and political possibilities. It also matters in what language one speaks, for the connotations vary as translations oftentimes offer productive disorientations to the given meanings in English, say. In the English language, however, the word international was coined in 1789, and it was coined, as is known, by Jeremy Bentham, through which he described a new branch of law that had until then been represented under the law of nations. This late 18th century coinage corresponded to Bentham's broader aspiration to clarify a distinction between what he called internal or domestic law and what he now called international law, and to designate, and this is crucial, a separate legal space for the regulation of interstate relations. Over the course of the 19th century, international underwent several mutations and transformations, and the word was first used as an adjective to describe new institutions and gatherings of multiple nations. But the adjective, and this is another crucial point I want to emphasize, later became interchangeable with a more familiar noun, world. This interchangeability can be glimpsed in a series of world fairs in the mid-19th century, about which I won't speak much, but this is where the interchangeability begins to appear. In the 19th century as well, international would gain a socialist revolutionary itinerary, one that was grounded in different political experiences and horizons of expectations and the juridical meaning that Bentham intended. For now, I just want to focus on the juridical meaning because it pertains to what we want to discuss about anti-colonialism, paradoxically. In its juridical itinerary, international was at the heart of at least two significant legal and political ruptures. First, there was the 19th century consolidation of something we call an international sphere of governance and action distinct from the domestic sphere. Hence, the anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, for anti-colonial struggles of the 20th century, internationalization or joining this sphere, this distinct sphere that we would begin to call international society, would become a mandate, an injunction. And I want to add, robbing this mandate would rob anti-colonialism of its non-juridical possibilities. I am thinking here from the example of Palestine, also in the 20th century, and the internationalization of the question of Palestine, its translation to a juridical international idiom. I say mandate also beyond Palestine because participation in the international stage would become the sole route of protection, but also, perhaps more importantly, of legibility, of appearance. Internationalization, in other words, widened the space of legible appearance. Its work must be understood as phenomenological. The refusal of legibility was becoming impossible. But what was the price of this legibility, and what were its darker sides? There were, of course, other internationalist efforts which did not proceed under the sign of the juridical international, informed by Marxist meanings. These internationalist efforts were less about membership in an already formed but expanding international community, and more about the gathering and the joining of distinct struggles and solidarities. This is the Third Worldist International, for example. In this itinerary, international charted encounters and networks of translation and struggle. Anti-colonial struggles were therefore nodes not in a family of nation, but in a community of friends. The second rupture that the juridical itinerary of international engendered was its conflation, the conflation of international, the juridical international with world. International began to stand in for world, to claim to fully exhaust it, to sum it up in its entirety by reinforcing its conception, world's conception, as a physical surface of states. At issue was not the direct substitution of one noun, world, for another, international. Rather, a new adjective, international, began to exhaust the meaning of the old name, a noun, world, implying world as it modified other nouns. It was an adjective that gradually denoted a noun. In our, and I'm concluding here my short intervention, in our political and juridical discourses today, we don't speak of internationalist solidarity, but of international solidarity, begging a question about the change of register. Our social scientific disciplines, and more generally our juridical political discourse, often conflate world with international, thereby depriving world of its philosophical, theological, and ethical underpinnings. Talk about world making in some registers reinforces the object status of world, but it also ignores that so many of the humans of this planet go about struggling through gestures much more modest than world making. Their struggles are in fact waged from the grounds of, not against, incapacity. And I'm speaking here from a Palestinian position as well. To describe them as makers of worlds is to skip over the devastation, the coloniality, the colonialism, not even the coloniality, to skip over the colonial devastation from which their struggle proceeds. It is to attribute majesty to a gift of courage that is offered from the most fragile of conditions. It is indeed to salute the outcome without undergoing, it is indeed to salute the outcome of decolonization without undergoing the struggle that entails danger, death, and grief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samera, for that scintillating intervention. We will continue in the dynamic of our roundtable, circulating amongst our participants questions that they received in advance, and that I will also post in the chat for the benefit of everyone to follow the discussion. Our next question is for Susana Draper. The question reads as follows: how does anti-colonial interdisciplinarity transform the quote-unquote language and visibility of the political? How does it allow us to engage critically with the quote presentism with which neoliberalism punctuates life, as Susana's work puts it? Susana.
Hi. Thank you so much, Hector and Joe, for the invitation to participate. It's also great to be here in dialogue with Samera and Joe. I hope my connection works. Can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay, because my computer just shut down. So it's very hard to answer briefly to the question. So one needs to make many, many decisions. And so to start somewhere, I would like to think of the anti-colonial interdisciplinarity as the name of a possibility to open creative forms of relationality among and across different fields of questions, no? And so to do this, I would briefly look at basically at how the ongoing international and popular feminism and feminist movements we see from the South, how they are posing questions about the legal, the juridical, and economic realms in ways that transform the language and visibility of the political, no? So I will be very schematic because of time, but if we have time, we can continue. So basically, I focus on forms of conceptualizing violence that challenge the rhetoric of the legal, economic, and juridical as separate spheres, and spheres that the long process of capitalist accumulation also configures as separately, no? And so from there, the possibility of connecting and relating questions about the meanings of the legal is crucial because it involves the necessity of reimagining them, if possible, in anti-colonial forms, no? And so this involves to depart from the liberal understanding of the law that have continued a long history of colonialism in post-colonial times, and also from the logics of security and policing that have continued forms of US intervention all over the world and forms of imperialism, no? In this kind of process that have continued the Cold War policies on the war on drugs policing, and where what we see is the configuration also of this discourse on securitization that applies internationally through the creation of international security data banks, where like all the countries are sharing the information. And as Robinson Salazar and Janice Rojas says, they are homogenizing a perception of crime, of what qualifies as crime, and of sentencing. And at the same time, this goes along a process of capitalist accumulation that is restructuring laws to allow for the expropriation of land, water, and the destruction of communities. So as Nietzsche and Marx in different ways were always emphasizing, the more you destroy and expropriate a community, the more crucial criminalization becomes, and therefore forms of like measuring punishment, the punishment of those who have been expropriated. No? And I bring this because I think this is kind of the landscape in which we need to think, and in which the different forms of feminism that are taking place in the South are allowing us to think what to think about justice and the legal realm involves when we look at this broader picture, no? And within an horizon that Silvia Federici explains carefully throughout her like every work, how capitalist accumulation processes and waves of capitalist accumulation are always accompanied by an intensification of violence against women and feminized bodies, no? And then how from there, the popular mobilizations are allowing for an understanding of violence that goes beyond and looking at violence as a single issue, and where gender violence appears, as Veronica Gago says, as a complex problem, no? Where it is not to talk only about violence against women and feminized bodies, but to put that violence in relation with a set of violence, without which gender violence cannot be explained, no? And so this problematization and conceptualization on violence that is coming from the movements and in the South allow us to think of putting in relation in ways that make it more difficult and more challenging to think of justice, because there is this tendency, as Maria Lopez says in her book about Ni Una Menos, that there is a logic of the states to translate and limit the demands for justice that the feminist movements are posing within a logic of security and a logic of criminalization. And that involves this also, again, this colonial logic, no, of more militarization, more policing, etc. No? So the question is how, for instance, to land this in a specific or concrete situations, if we see that much of feminicide violence from which many migrant women escape and have to cross borders is not resolved only with like having a law that penalizes the person who can commit violence against one woman, but it would involve the necessity of a legislation that would stop the violence that comes from this long and deep colonialist process of expropriation that is placing all this violence in communities that are expropriated, and then that, as Don Palais, under the name of the war on drugs, we see a militarization and forms of imperial intervention that have been expanding the capitalist system into previously inaccessible territories and social spaces. So in that sense, the emphasis that popular feminism place on the impossibility of separating body and territory, for example, illuminates new paths and languages to understand the political that complicate and connect to this idea of anti-colonial interdisciplinarity, I think. So in that sense, one way in which this is always kind of stopped or often stopped is when they tell us, well, you have to be realistic. If you say that, you look at interrelated processes of violence, then the question about ending violence becomes very difficult because it implies many levels, no? And of course, we need to imagine forms of answering to that, because in their language, words, images become crucial because they allow us to move beyond the political frame that is always resisting the connection among problems and dimensions. So from there, this allows us to make visible ways of understanding processes of violence that have been naturalized for decades and centuries in ways that not only denounce, but resignify meanings to unfold other paths to live and to desire, no? Which is very important also in the movements, in the present. And so here I bring, like Emanuela Borsacciello and Valeria Galanti's study, for instance, in how language is crucial in popular feminist mobilizations now as a place from where to deactivate forms of violence that are always reinforced by media narratives as instances of normalization through stereotypes, through simplification, through this logic of fear and more security, etc. No? And so usually language and imagining is placed as secondary in relation to legislation, for instance, and etc. And at the same time, it is something that is essential, because without that, we cannot really grasp the big picture and the horizon in which the question about justice and ending violence is placed, and the horizon that it can open politically, mostly because these are always problems and issues that have not been considered relevant politically in the left or in the right historically, So this involves in that way how to reconfigure the way we imagine these interconnected forms of violence and translate that into a different form of problematizing law and justice. But I will come back to this later. Sorry if I took more time.
Thank you so much, Susana. That was wonderful. And I think there's already so much we can build on between Samera's presentation and this presentation, just beginning with the location to think the international from a very specific place, Palestine, and then moving on to this idea of understanding these feminist struggles, these populist struggles from very specific places and from specific experiences as challenging narratives of visibility, right? I think there's so much already. But I would like to pass the word to Joseph Slaughter. And the question would be, how does art form intersect with differing disciplinary frameworks within and beyond literary studies? And how do quasi-genres, note the scare quotes as my papers fall, such as the human rights narrative, challenge or affirm disciplinary divisions?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Joe and Hector, for producing this. I'm really delighted to be here and be part of this conversation and the efforts that you're undertaking at Stanford, and glad to see more allies out there working on these kinds of questions, thinking about literature and humanities from and about the Global South. I'm going to bend the question, I think, actually to a bit to where I'm thinking from in the kind of same spirit, I think, as both Susana and Samera. And I think that maybe will give us a line of continuity that will be helpful here. And I'm especially interested in thinking about, I'll talk a little bit about genre, but I'm especially interested in thinking about the imperative of anti-colonial interdisciplinarity, right? What we need in order to know things that otherwise remain absolutely invisible, suppressed, oppressed, illegible to any kind of dominant and even radical metropolitan discourses. So I've been struck by the phrase in kind of thinking about the topic for this conversation, the anti-colonial interdisciplinarity, and how much it seems to me to name my own academic formation, that of my comrades at the University of Texas at Austin in the 1990s in ethnic and third world literatures, and thinking constantly across spaces and across disciplines, without necessarily, with literature and cultural studies always as a place to think from, right? Not a place to start. My own knowledge about the history, the formation of international law and the international order begins but doesn't end with literary and cultural studies, specifically in Latin America and Africa, the spaces that I spent my time in graduate school working on. And I would argue that to understand the history and politics of the formation of the international and political and legal orders, it's absolutely necessary to pay attention to the fields of literature and cultural production in dominated spaces where knowledge that is otherwise unavailable resides, where it persists, and where other visions of non-colonial or post-colonial or non-dominated futures also persist. So I want to give a couple of examples, both from my own areas of knowledge and my own work, but I'm going to start actually with what I think of as a negative example, with a short anecdote that I don't think I've ever told in a formal setting like this before. So, but it's time in some ways. About 10 years ago, when Sam Moyn published his first book on human rights, The Last Utopia, he and I were both colleagues at Columbia University, and the Department of History asked me to come do the book launch, to be a member on a panel of the book launch for him with Bashir Jian in the French department and philosophy department. This was obviously before the book was a massive success and set off the revolution in the new historiography of human rights, right? And Moyn's book, as you all know, it set out to demystify what I've later called the Western romance of human rights. That is that self-serving story that the West tells itself repeatedly, that human rights are the signal invention of European and American revolutionary struggles, that they're a gift to the rest of the world, even if that gift came through the structures and processes of colonialism and exploitation. As I read the book in preparation for this book launch, I became increasingly frustrated by the very narrow disciplinary approach, the intellectual historian's disciplinary approach, the very narrow geographical approach that could identify only thinkers in Europe, particularly France, Germany, and then thinkers in the US, as sources of thought on questions of law and questions of human rights. In effect, the book offers us an account of how a couple of really important Western thinkers, European and American thinkers, adopted the language of human rights with some earnestness, and this gets called the birth of human rights. So despite its iconoclastic intentions, it recenters ultimately European subjects as the principal authors, originators, and agents of human rights discourse. And what the part about this story that I want to kind of highlight here is that as I was reading through the book and becoming increasingly frustrated with the narrowness of this story, I suddenly stopped and said to myself, you know, this is a book that can only be written by somebody who has never read an African novel. This is a book that can only be written by somebody who has never read post-colonial literature in any way. Because if one had had to read any kind of post-colonial literature, one would have been struck by the ubiquity of the language of human rights, the language of self-determination, articulated as such throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in literatures of Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and elsewhere. In other words, if one's going to try to tell the story, even a radical story that revises the history of human rights and decenters the European story in some fashion, but concentrates on French, American, German intellectual thinkers, one is going to miss not just some of the story, but most of the story, right? And most of that story, it was apparent to me, to people who worked in literary studies of the Global South, people who worked in political theory of the Global South, who had any familiarity with the discourse as it circulated in other areas. My own disciplinary training, that is, if we can call ethnic and third world studies a discipline, my own disciplinary training in some sense made it overwhelmingly obvious that the disciplinary answer being offered by history, the disciplinary answer being offered by intellectual history, couldn't possibly understand the complexities of the multiple histories, the multiple languages, and the multiple discourses of human rights. So let me just give one example. I don't want to take up too much time here. So let me give just one example of where a reader, someone who had read some African literature, for example, might have understood the history of human rights differently, or might have been able to recognize immediately the problematic of naming Europe and the US as the centers of human rights thinking. This is, as I said, one example. In 1911, the Gold Coast, later becomes Ghana, the Gold Coast lawyer, writer, and politician J.E. Casely Hayford published a genre-bending novel called Ethiopia Unbound, with its subtitle, Studies in Race Emancipation. The novel doesn't adequately describe what this thing is. It's a hybrid text of imaginative fiction. It's 40 years before Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, that everybody talks about as the first African novel. A text of imaginative fiction, political theory, anti-colonial polemic that makes a strong argument for the human right of self-determination. And it makes it in those terms. Human rights and self-determination are the languages. This is 1911. That is, let me remind you, before Woodrow Wilson, before Vladimir Lenin, who have become the touchstones for the beginning of any kind of history of the language of self-determination within the international law and international history. The very existence of such a book by Casely Hayford means that this is not the peculiar ideas of one thinker that can be separated from the context of a social and historical situation of colonialism. It circulated as part of a much broader discussion throughout the colonial world and in the colonial metropole as a major statement about self-determination and human rights. If one wanted to tell a history, a legal history of the international order, or a legal history of the concept of self-determination, or a legal history of international law, such a book entirely troubles that history if the history is going to begin and end with the United Nations or the League of Nations or the halls of the major institutions. More than that, this book, I would argue, I've got a couple of other examples that I'll come back to later in later questions. This book, I would argue, not only troubles the potted history of somebody like Moyne's version of self-determination, it also troubles the history of anti-colonialism as we are telling it to ourselves today. Because Casely Hayford argued in 1911 a position that is almost unrecognizable or almost uncognizable from the perspective of decolonial discourse today. He made an anti-colonial argument for the imperialization of West Africa. That is, he made an anti-colonial argument for the Gold Coast's entry on an equal footing within the international order of the British Empire as his horizon for political and cultural freedom. These kinds of locations, Casely Hayford is just one small example, but these quasi-genres that Joe mentioned, these locations, these kinds of resources, these kinds of archives, and an anti-colonial interdisciplinary approach to them are absolutely imperative if we are to both revive and redescribe and reanimate a desire for an international order or a world order or a human order that is different in some way. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've had a wonderful first round of responses, and what I'll do now is to comment on some of the wonderful ideas set forward and to segue into the next portion of our discussion. So first, a word about this idea of anti-colonial interdisciplinarity. There are at least two senses in which one can understand this. One is to mobilize interdisciplinarity to the service of an anti-colonial agenda. And I think that, Joey, the kind of disciplinary formation that you had the benefit of getting, was really geared towards that project, Avant la Lettre. And then the other is to think about the colonial relations between disciplines, right? This idea that all of the humanities, of course, and the social sciences are subservient to the homo economicus, right? What Foucault would call the homo economicus. But while we're at that, then maybe let's make that the discipline of economy or business administration also as an intellectual project, right? Engineering, because technology itself creates wealth, and so on and so forth. I mean, there are ways in which our disciplines, I'll go ahead and say on the record, right, colonize each other, right? They colonize their methodologies, or take up their space. And so this conversation happens at least in those two registers that I want to emphasize, and also to float that idea by you all to see what you make of it. I'd also like to mention, in the spirit, Samera was reminding us that we have this conflation of the juridical international with the world. And I'd like to remind us that thinking about the world, and I'm deriving here a little bit from Peng Chea's work, is something that literature does more or less critically, more or less problematically. I'll mention only two, I think, de rigueur references there. That would be Goethe's formulation early in the 19th century, in his correspondence with Eckermann, the famous, "The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach." This idea that the world is becoming one, that the German, of course, Germany is not a nation state at the time, this is important, right? Ideals and humanity's ideal, right, is becoming indeed universal, and this universal age of world literature is upon us, and we have to come and meet that challenge. Then later in the 19th century, in 1848, you have an important reformulation of the question in Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party, where they describe how there are new wants that require satisfaction from distant lands, which leads to economic interdependence. The way they put it is, and as in material, so also in intellectual production. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. Of course, these passages are subject to differing interpretations. One that I think is good to keep in mind in the Marx and Engels bit is that what emerges as a world literature is a world proletarian literature that counters the other forces of the bourgeois taking over of the international sphere. So I mentioned this, obviously because Marx and Engels are important interlocutors. I think also Goethe is, but because it reminds us, right, that this is happening at the same time in international law and in literature, right? In the world of ideas, they are of a piece, and so we could not address one without the other. I think it's very easy to reaffirm Eurocentrism. One kind of only does that by default. And I don't mean, by citing Goethe to bring us back to the, good old German tradition or anything of the sort. And it's also very easy to maintain those regimes of invisibility of the processes of violence that Susana has been describing, right? There is some effort involved in going against the grain there. With all this in mind, right, these two formulations of anti-colonial interdisciplinarity, a reminder of the connections between the legal realm and literature, we'd like to ask a question for everyone, for all of our panelists, to tackle in any order as you see fit. We could do the same order that we did in the first round, reverse order, we could have people interject, debate, and so on. But the question is as follows. And of course, this is just a guiding question that people can adapt in any way they see fit. How to reimagine the disciplines in which you work and their interrelations in ways that do not replicate colonial forms of thinking, right? A very open-ended question. We're not going to solve it today, but it would be great if we can make some headway for sure. I posted the question on the chat, and the floor is open for anyone who'd like to take it away.
I can begin, I guess. The first thing I guess I would say, I'm not sure how much I'll be able to respond to the question, because I think the question is loaded, obviously with a particular answer in mind, right? Even though I know that's to be the topic and the question. So what I guess I would start by saying is that we know that the academic disciplines were forged in the context of colonialism, right? That we inhabit disciplines that were forged to manage the international structures of exploitation, and to manage imperialism, right? Just like everything else. These were the world we inhabit was organized to manage those things. It doesn't mean I don't think that we can do without them, right? And it doesn't mean that we can simply dismiss them, or we can somehow magically bring the coloniality out of them, right? Out of the disciplines. But I think to come back to some of your examples, Hector, that you were raising about the world literature and the Goethe moment, those kinds of things. If I go back and I think about the initial impetuses for what became Human Rights Inc., a book that tries to give a kind of hidden account of the history of the emergence of international human rights law, by thinking from the perspective of a kind of global South literary studies and the genre of the Bildungsroman across the global South, I realize, probably not at the time, but pretty quickly in retrospect, that project was actually started as two different disciplinary questions that ultimately needed each other in some ways to be able to answer, to be able to reveal something about the international order. And the first was a legal question. It was a legal historical question. It was, where does this phrase, the free and full development of the human personality, that appears in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights come from? It just shows up. It seems kind of inexplicable, and it's a bizarre, it seems a pat formulation and also bizarre at the same time. And if you go to the historical archives of the law, you can't really find an answer to that. The second question that I was interested in trying to understand was, how do we account for the fact that so many novels coming from the global South in the anti-colonial and in the post-colonial period were coming of age novels? What's the explanation, what's the sociological, phenomenological explanation for that? And it turned out, at least as I was working on these two kinds of separate questions, that these things overlapped in some way, and that you couldn't answer the question about where the language of international law came from without being able to say something about, without understanding something about the proliferation of the Bildungsroman genre globally as a particular kind of formation. But you also couldn't say something about the globalization of the coming of age novel without understanding something about the development of international law and its relationship to imperialism and colonialism. That these things were intertwined in such a way. And what it meant for me was that the international legal question couldn't be answered by international legal history. But the literary studies question couldn't be answered by literary studies. The terms under which each of the disciplines would ask these questions provided completely inadequate answers. And so the necessity, it seemed to me, of that kind of interdisciplinary interaction, I don't want to talk about it as colonizing one discipline, meant that it was the only way to make visible something that seems clearly in retrospect to have been, for me at least, the right answer for the appearance of a legal phenomenon and a literary phenomenon.
Thank you. I'm here taking notes.
You're muted, Susana.
I think you're muted, Susana. I can unmute you. How about that? Let me do that right now. Let's see.
In the meantime, as we sort out the technical aspects, we are graciously supported by Stanford Global Studies, SGS, which is the parent structure of many area studies centers at Stanford. So the Center for Latin American Studies, Russian, Eastern European Studies, South Asian Studies, right? All of these area study centers. So when Joey was referring a moment ago to how disciplines are there to manage international structures of exploitation, I mean, we all know the U.S. State Department support for these area study centers, but we also know that that framework has long outlived itself. So yeah, I just wanted to react by thanking our sponsors graciously for allowing us to historicize their conditions of possibility. And yeah, just put that on the table as well. Susana, please go ahead.
Okay, now I can know it's unmute. Yeah, I mean, to answer, I mean, it's difficult, but I would say that anti-colonial interdisciplinarity allow us to bring this possibility of relations that are crucial to bring and open multiple understandings. Of course, the question that you were posing was mentioning and pointing also to this usual hierarchization. I mean, besides the colonialist logic within the universities and mostly in the US, for instance, but it's also a problem that usually there is this hierarchization, and I would say, for instance, in the questions I was bringing in the first part, or this problematization of the law and of justice, when we frame the problem in a complexity of multiple dimensions, then usually if we talk about literature, it sounds always as something not really relevant, no? And this brings us also to the problem, I think I ended the first answer there, how, for instance, gender violence has been usually not considered politically relevant as other problems, no? Within like a certain idea of politics. And then we find kind of similar processes of marginalization, no, within the disciplines. And at the same time, I think that there, the idea of a form of anti-colonial interdisciplinarity is very important, because it is from there that we can bring forms of knowledge and forms of collective memory in which these forms of hierarchization are not taking place, no? And I think here, for instance, when we look at forms of juridical like pluralism in the South that are like confronting forms of like the liberal sense of the law, and to bring the collective ideas of how to deal with justice without individualizing problems, no? In the idea of the liberal subject, there we see all that one level, but then we see at another level that in literature, for instance, I am seeing more and more interventions within like popular feminism in the South, of like bringing even like legajos and juridical cases to the space of literature, and to talk about, in Spanish, justicia a palabra propia, like justice, you know, as a process that has to do with the word, and to make the word collective, and to visualizing a problem that is not an individual problem, but that is a collective problem, and that we need to deal with it collectively. So from there, the possibility of opening other forms of literary imagination, and following what Joe was saying, no, and what this means in other places, I think that allows us to also enrich the question about the legal within an anti-colonial space, no, of knowledge that would go across disciplines, but then also across forms of imagining, I would say. So I don't know, I think there is a very challenging question, and then at the same time, it's an opening of different paths to also rethink the university, no? Because we have to like engage and re-articulate short and long-term memories of resistance, but also of doing differently and thinking differently these problems, and then to also look at longer like sequences of different forms of violence that sometimes we see as in the present and totally disconnected from the past. And so I think the anti-colonial interdisciplinarity would allow for this other ways, no? And here I think also that forms that are being now called of like transformative justice, you know, these other ways of problematizing injustice, and for instance, gender violence, are very like important, because they are opening other horizons where I bring, let me find Mia Mingus, for instance, when she defines forms of transformative justice, from the intersection of like popular feminism, Black feminism, and prison abolition. She says, how can we respond to violence in ways that not only address the current incident of violence, but that also help to transform the conditions that allow for it to happen, no? And so the answer involves multiple realms of equal relevance, no? And there we have also the question that when you invited us to participate here and connect with Adam Getachew, the role of word making, no? Which is a form of dealing with this critique and anti, but in ways that are not only denouncing, but creating other possibilities, no? And this is very important. And to bring this to the university, no? So I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Susana. I'll pass the mic over, as it were, to Samera.
Thank you for this. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for thinking anti-colonial and not decolonization, especially how the language of decolonization has become so hegemonic these days, and the unpairing of anti-colonialism from decolonization is quite troubling. So I thank you for insisting on the anti-colonial. This unpairing, by the way, is legal as well, in that anti-colonialism was understood to be the force that led to decolonization, and therefore it's buried in history. It's the historical means, it's the historical agent, and then we get decolonization. And I'm not saying it's only legal, but I'm saying this disappearance of anti-colonialism is in part a legal, international legal account that historicizes anti-colonialism and keeps us with decolonization, however critical we might be of it, or most of us are of it, obviously. So I work in the disciplines of law, politics, history, and humanities, and I do attempt to think what it means to eliminate anti-colonialism. That for me is the question from within these disciplines, which are in tension with each other and offer different methods. And so how do I mobilize these disciplines, and in what combination almost, in order to illuminate the possibilities of anti-colonialism that are with us today, without historicizing anti-colonialism as a force of the past. So let me begin by just saying a few notes, and then I will tell you about the combination for my own work, it works for what I attempt to do, and it's always an attempt. But of course, I will note that there is no non-colonial landscape to which we can resort, as Joey said. I do not think that decolonization, in the limited sense even of the evacuation of coloniality, is possible. The task is instead to recognize that colonialism has set, and to think of anti-colonial possibilities and resistances to these limits. And therefore, the possibilities can only emerge from resistances and from struggle. They cannot be just imagined as purity outside of the struggle against the limits that colonialism had set. I'm not hinting here at any subversive modality of anti-colonialism, far from it. I'm thinking along lines, for example, that Susana was also thinking I'm suggesting that one must recognize the limits that have been set, the destruction that has been taken place, the forms of life and thought that have been displaced. One cannot will them away. The anti-colonial possibility in this sense is from the limit and in response to it. And it alone, I think, can point to a passage. You can already see that what I think really is crucial is the question of struggle, and we cannot ignore it and focus on some pure thought that can deliver us away from colonialism through the image of decolonization. So to teach anti-colonial interdisciplinarity is also to think of communities of friends, of feminists, of people in solidarity, as opposed to families of nations, and to compare and to contrast and to see the differences in order to turn the question of the difference into a question, not an assertion, into an invitation to investigate. It is also to teach anti-colonial interdisciplinarity, for me, is is it's teaching about struggles that do not orient themselves necessarily, although some of them do, as Joey said, but I would want to also include struggles that do not orient themselves towards any inclusion in international institution or in mainstream institutions. And I think this is crucial, and we talk less about that. However equal and non-hierarchical they might be, and including struggles that do not model themselves on sovereign states or sovereign war. It is for me to carve out a space of non-juridical forms of life or other juridical forms of life, that is, for the forms of life that are within legal regimes that are not state law or are not international law. It is to think with other legal orders. It is indeed always to attempt, and it is a question and attempt because it's not easy, to release politics from the sign of state and international law, to register their colonizing capacities, and to inquire about other modalities of political and legal action that have been destroyed yet not eradicated. It is to think with their sediments today. It is indeed to weave a tentative alliance between the past traditions and the future to come. Finally, to think of, with anti-colonial possibility, not finally, two more points, is to displace the authority of international law, like so many amazing scholars and activists have been doing. Not because its legal acts are unjust, but because it can only proceed by declaring realms of anarchy external to it. But these realms of anarchy are precisely the homes of so many of yesterday's and today's struggles. These realms exist as anarchy only when abiding to the meta-narrative of international society as safeguarding peaceful coexistence against threats of violence. But these external sides, these outsides, these outdoors, as folks in Black studies would call them, are not, even though they are sites of abandonment, they are also sites in which sites of obstinacy of other traditions and other practices of struggle that remain with us. They lack a positive juridical signification of their own, but they allow us to appreciate and to get closer, to get the gift. And I think it's a gift, the gift of anti-colonial struggle. So what is then anti-colonial interdisciplinarity given all of this? It is training our senses to appreciate this gift. And this is perhaps one of its most key urgent tasks for me. The social sciences and the legal studies are crucial for diagnosing the limits that colonialism sets. Anthropologists, meanwhile, illuminate practices, not by describing them, but by revealing to us what they challenge and what they do and the different form of life they unfold under. Historians teach us to approach the past as a resource of various, as an archive of various traditions of struggle that remain as sediments today in the present. Indigenous scholars teach us about forms of life that have refused and have gone even without refuse and that have unfolded under a different cosmological order. But the humanities too, and this is where I think offer something quite important, and this is, they're critical, and I don't know if I'm going to articulate this well because it's something I keep thinking about. They are critical to sensing the non-empirical possibility that anti-colonial struggle is. Sensing the non-empirical possibility. It's just like a poet illuminates an image without prescribing it. The humanities offer us tools to that sense, the sense of struggle. And I think to make the latter, the sense of struggle, central, I don't think it works alone. I do think we need the social sciences and the limits and the structures. But I think understanding the sense of struggle, or what Susana was calling imagination, or in Joey's language, it was also about the literary, equipping our students really with sensing that possibility that is not empirical, that cannot be posited, is actually is central to expanding our appreciation for what takes on, what goes on in the world that we inhabit.
Thank you very much. I'd like to imagine us all in an auditorium and to hear the roaring applause. This has been such an amazing conversation. Allow me to just tie a couple of threads here and there. And thereafter, what we'll do is maybe stop the recording so that we can open it up to questions and take in also folks who might like to turn on their cameras and so on. So here's my very quick closing statement here. Yes, Samera, you're spot on about the anti, how anti is a much better prefix, I think, these days than post or de. It allows us to deploy the kind of dialectic and thoughtful antagonism that I think we need. Also with Susana, the call to talk about the plural, right, in a way that goes beyond, I don't know, Charles Taylor's 1990s multiculturalism. This pluriversality that we're dealing with has the potential to really transform things very profoundly. Then, Joey, when you mentioned, and at various points, you touched on some fascinating precedents, I want to say, or texts that are not part of the traditional narrative there. One question that emerges, and here I'm thinking a little bit with what Bruno Bostiels does reading Jorge Luis Borges, right? Bruno goes back to the phrase of amonedar el lenguaje, to coin language, to turn language into currency, right? What can we do with these texts that should be current, right? But they're not. And we also cannot make them current by fiat. We cannot, or at least not one individual or those of us here in the room, change the narrative of human rights. Say, I mean, Joey, you've come as close as anyone has, right? Don't get me wrong. But there's that challenge of what to do when the institutions are in place and they have these shaky feet, but they're quite solid nonetheless. I'll also echo something I believe, Samera, you were mentioning, that is that inclusion is not necessarily the answer, and neither is subversion. So, where to next, right? And it's good to end in an open, difficult, unanswered question. If it's neither inclusion nor subversion, where to next? What is the agenda? And maybe it's okay, to be comfortable with not knowing, but at least knowing some directions that we might not want to pursue. Before we stop the recording, anyone would like to add something else to this portion that will live after we're all gone and there are no computers on Earth? Okay, so Joe, whenever you're ready, please press it.
All right. Yes, we'll save all the conversation and that. We'll move to the non-recorded portion. Again, thank you all. This has been fantastic and so much to think about. As Samera said, this is an invitation to think more. And I think that phrase, to train the senses to appreciate the gift of anti-colonial struggle, well, so thank you so much for that. All right. That's my closing statement, I guess.